This is American Government for both Wednesday, March 9th, which I missed because of illness, and for Monday, March 14th, which I will miss because I will be at a wedding in Baltimore. So this material will cover the material on the syllabus under Federalism, and I'll probably divide this into 3 or 4 segments instead of 2 long 1 hour and 40-minute segments, which would be a normal class time, since I don't think any human being has the ability to sit through that much of me in any one particular time, unless you are benefiting from my magnificent presence in person. So this material for today is based upon Chapter 3 in the Wilson Reader on Federalism, and I'll discuss that at the beginning and then at the end of these remarks for Monday, March 14th lecture. And it will also cover the readings from the Nichols Reader, the Sentinel reading number 5, which is on pages 222 to 24, the Jefferson reading, which is selection number 14 in the Nichols Reader from pages 61 through 63. It will then turn to Federalist 11 by Alexander Hamilton, which is selection number 80 in the Nichols Reader on page 461 through 464. And then we will turn to McCulloch v. Maryland, important court case from 1819, which is Nichols number 16 on pages 62 through 73. And then we'll also turn to a reiteration of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which is selection number 4 in the Nichols Reader, pages 11 through 18. And the last reading in this section will be from Nichols number 19, William Chambra, on the new citizenship, which is at page 87 through 84. If I can walk you through the notes, which I will append in an email with the links to these recordings, I'll set out the issue in Roman numeral 1 on the first page of the notes, and then we'll turn to the way I'll structure this is like a debate between small, large community. And so Roman numeral 2 will be examine the goods of the small local community, which is the primary position of the Anti-Federalists, but of many individuals since the time of the founding, including Sentinel, who was a real Anti-Federalist, more about that, and Jefferson, who was not a real Anti-Federalist, but was an advocate of small local community. Then we'll turn in Roman numeral 3 on page 2 of the notes to the goods of a large national community, represented, of course, by the best representative of the large, vigorous national community, Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 11. And then in Roman numeral 4, we'll see that the Constitution tries to split the goods of the strong national community and the vibrant local community, and we'll see in the rest of this material how that balance filters out. So first we'll see why the large national community has to take precedence over a small community, or for state sovereignty or semi-sovereignty. And we'll look at that in 2 ways, through the McCulloch v. Maryland, the great case in 1819, and also from a selection from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which I mentioned before from the Nichols Reader. And last, we'll turn to, on Roman numeral 5, or next to last, when should the national government give way to the states? And William Chambra is a friend of mine from graduate school who wrote this article, and Nichols included it, to argue that it's time to reinvigorate the states in our constitutional system. And then in the last part of these notes, in Roman numeral 6 on page 5 of the notes, we'll turn to the different understandings of the federal-state relationship and some of the issues that present us now as a nation. So go back to the first page of the notes. What's this issue, federalism? And what the issue is the division of power between the national government and the states in our constitutional system. And, by the way, the states and counties and localities, too. I have to say that after teaching this material, in fact, this was the first lecture I gave at Converse College in February of 1986. 36 years ago? Almost 37 years ago? I can't even count. And I have to say that in teaching this material for many years, the issue of federalism is a yawner for undergraduates who could care less and tend to find it one of the most boring issues in American politics. Yet, as Wilson in Chapter 3 suggests, this issue actually requires and merits a good deal of serious attention. First of all, It is the longest set of tensions in American politics since the founding. Almost every major controversial issue, from the National Bank that will investigate in McCulloch v. Maryland, to the question of slavery, to the question of the Union in the Civil War, to the question of the expansion of national power under the New Deal, and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s, and even national health care with Obamacare, and some issues of immigration, etc. All of these tend to filter out or find themselves articulated along this great question of the proper division between the state governments, state and local governments, and the national government in our system. Second, you have to remember that this is the issue that led to the bloodiest conflict in American life, the Civil War, which really meant blood and destruction on our soil. It's true, in terms of all the wars that America has been in, the Civil War has the highest death toll. And recently, in the last couple of years, historians have actually upped the death count from about 650 to about 750,000 Americans, about 2 million injured, etc., plus led to the destruction of the Southern economy. And even the war, World War II, that has the second highest death toll for Americans, about 500,000. And for your information, then World War I, the Vietnam War, about 57,000. The Korean War, about 33,000. But nevertheless, the Civil War was the bloodiest conflict between Americans. So, as we'll see, this issue is not exactly a tepid one. And again, and this is what the Chambre article will show, it's actually this question of the proper dividing line between the national government and the states is still more or less the core issue that makes our two parties different from each other. Now, later on in the course, when we examine our party system and the two-party system, we'll see that our parties are not like the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, which are polar opposites. They tend to be on either side of the middle, although, as we'll see, we've become a little more polarized as a nation in many ways. But this question, as you're going to see, insofar as the two parties, which basically represent the main things in American life, the same main things, nevertheless there are differences of emphasis in terms of whether we should expand and increase the role of the national government in our lives, which is basically the Democratic Party, and whether or not we should expand and increase the role of the states and local governments over our issues. By the way, you'll see there's actually the same question that's going on in the abortion debate too. So, anyway, well, that's what we'll explore in this section, and let's be guided by Wilson's opening discussion in Chapter 3 of the three systems or kinds of systems of government. Because as we saw when we looked at the founding and the difference between the Articles of Confederation and the shift from the Confederation of Sovereign States to a national union of individual Americans over semi-sovereign states, the American Constitution creates a kind of a new kind of federalism. And at the beginning of Wilson's chapter, in Chapter 3, he makes the distinction between a national system in which there's one national sovereign system. There may be local unions of government, but they have no independent existence or independent sovereignty or power. Sort of like the counties in a state. Like the state of South Carolina actually creates the counties and the cities in the state. So even though there are local divisions within South Carolina, like Cherokee County or Spartanburg County or etc., those counties have no independent existence beside the power of the state. In a national system like England or France, there may be local units of government, but they exist completely at the behest of the national government. Therefore, the national government is truly a unitary or a national system. In a confederal system like the Articles of Confederation or like the United Nations, you have sovereign states, which are themselves the members of the Union, and that actually control the nature of the whole Union. That's a confederal system, and that's what the Articles of Confederation was, of course. What we now call federal is actually the result of the invention of the Constitution, which tried to blend those two systems into a new kind of new federalism, which, as we've seen, constitutes of a sovereign people, the American people, who invest the Constitution, but then create the national government over the semi-sovereign states. So as we're going to see, the messiness of this question of trying to find the right dividing line between the national government and the states is kind of inherent in the compromise that is the constitutional system. So how to understand all these different arguments, I'll structure it like a debate. So if you're looking at the first page of the notes, first we'll examine what are the goods of the small local community. And again, this means the argument that power should primarily, governmental power, should remain primarily on the local level. And the two authors that we'll examine again are Sentinel, an anti-federalist, more about that in a minute, and Jefferson. Then we'll turn to the goods of the strong national government. And again, as I mentioned before, represented by that great advocate of strong national government, Alexander Hamilton, in Federalist 11. Now, the students among you will know that Federalist 11 was the next paper in line after Federalist 10. And if you go back in my lecture that lays out the outline of the Federalist Papers, remember, after arguing for the goods of the introduction, then the Federalist Papers, essentially through number 14 actually, examine the goods of a strong national union, and this is where this paper takes place. Remember, in Federalist 10, Madison argued that that one of the goods of a strong national union was controlling the vices of faction, and especially majority faction, if you remember. And so Federalist 11 turns to the next argument for a strong national government, and we'll examine that argument. And then the third, we'll look again, since the Constitution tries to have both ends of the bargain. It tries to have both a strong national government and a strong state and local governments. We'll see where the balance lies. And this means primarily when the national the national government or community has to prevail over the states. And again, the two kinds of limits on the states within our system under the national government will come from McCulloch v. Maryland. We'll walk through that court case, and from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which I'll talk a little bit more about historical background. And then last, we'll talk about when the states should perhaps be strengthened or preferred in our system, and that's what the Chambra article will examine. I noticed in my notes I forgot to put the fourth part of that debate, but that's what the fourth part is, as you'll see. So let's turn to the first topic, which is why should the goods of the small local community, why should government or governmental power remain on the local level? And the first author we'll examine for this is Sentinel. Now, Sentinel was an anti-federalist. If you remember in the debate over the Constitution, the people that supported the Constitution in the ratification struggle were the Federalists. And the anti-federalists were the ones who opposed the Constitution and wanted to stay with the old Articles of Confederation on the grounds that you couldn't create a national government as strong and as powerful as the national government under the Constitution without ultimately the loss of liberty. And you'll see that's exactly what Sentinel argues, and that argument will be echoed in Jefferson. More about that in a minute. So Sentinel, by the way, like most of the people in the debate, like in fact matter the Federalist Papers, they, even though were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, they all wrote those 85 essays under the pseudonym, the false name of Publius. Most of the participants in the debate over the Constitution chose nom de plume, pen names, and Sentinel was a writer in Pennsylvania, an opponent of the Constitution. And this is his argument. Now, what's interesting is Sentinel, and this is, again, beginning on page 22 through 24 of the Nichols Reader, Sentinel starts out his argument with an interesting observation, one that he shares with Madison in Federalist 51, that all holders of power have a tendency to govern in their own self-interest. And one problem is, especially in a popular form of government, is that the people don't pay attention to politics. So in some ways, why don't people pay attention to politics? And by the way, I think this was true for Madison in Federalist 51. It was true for Sentinel in this essay. And probably true today, that probably for most of you and for most Americans, unless there's some emergency issue like COVID or something going on, their primary attention is not politics. They don't pay attention. Most Americans don't read newspapers. Only a slight plurality of Americans actually listen to television news, and many young people get their news from social media and the internet, insofar as they pay attention. And I have to say, as a college professor, it's been my experience that college students are the least informed. And I'm not trying to insult you, it just happens to be the case, that you're paying attention to other things in your life. And as you move on through your life and you get a career and you get a family and you start to have children and start to pay your own taxes, The reason most people don't pay attention to politics is because in America we allow people to pretty much pursue their private lives, and that's where most people's energies and attention goes. So if most governors and most people in power have a tendency to govern their own interest, Sentinel does think that a Republican form of government, which you hold the people in office responsible through elections, is the best. But then how do you make sure that the people retain some kind of control over elections if they're not paying attention to politics? And so this is why Sentinel prefers the state-centered and local-centered government under the Articles of Confederation. Because his argument is, if the people aren't going to pay much attention to politics, in order for Republican or popular government to work, you've got to do two things. One, you've got to keep the government simple in structure. Now, this is the opposite of what Madison says in Federalist 51, because if people in office tend to move by their own self-interest and ambition, the best way to control that is construct a complex kind of government where the interest of one institution and the ambition of one office holder is matched against another, and the self-interest of one will balance and control the self-interest of the other. That's not to say that Madison wanted a system where people didn't pay attention to elections, but kind of agreeing with Sentinel, if they're not, best to have a complex system of government, separation of powers and checks and balances, where the self-interest of one office holder balances and checks the self-interest of another institution and office holder. Well, Sentinel has just the opposite conclusion to the same problem. Instead of having a complex system of government, separation of powers and checks and balances, rather keep a simple structure of government so that relatively ignorant and non-attentive publics can pay attention to the issues of government. And I have to say, so by the way, that's why, remember, Pennsylvania, of the original 13 states, like Georgia, were the only two states that had unicameral single-house legislatures, with short terms, by the way, and non-electable offices, re-electable offices. For Sentinel, this is the only way to keep to give power or control through elections to inattentive publics. Keep it simple so that an inattentive public, so far as is possible, can pay attention to issues. And there's no question that, as we see when we turn to Congress, that having a bicameral legislature, plus, not only that, you add to the internal dynamics of the committee system and everything, most Americans have no idea, unless something hits the national news, what's going on inside of Congress. So Sentinel's first solution is to keep government simple, its structure, and so that the people can follow it. But the most important part of his argument is to keep it local. Why? First of all, he thinks that a single national government won't be able to represent the complexity of local interests. And it's like if there was only one national newspaper or one national television network that had no local news, you can imagine what would happen to the coverage of local issues. In the same way, to have one single national government that had all aspects of government within its power, Sentinel thinks that the diversity between, after all, New York is not Dallas or Spartanburg. They're different places, and they have different, in some ways, different values. So if there was so to keep government local, powerful on the local level, means you'll have a government that could actually take into account the local differences among people. And then second, he argues that only representatives from a relatively small area would be knowledgeable to the people. And ultimately, if you keep government on the local level, that means government will be absorbed in things like roads and schools, which people have an interest in. And by the way, I have to say it's interesting, in our national politics and our local politics, control over the schools and parents' control over local schools is one of the big issues in our national politics. In fact, you could say the governor's race in Virginia last year was primarily won by a candidate who argued that parents should have more control over local school boards when issues of COVID or sexuality, etc. In a way, Sentinel is making that argument. And ultimately, this is the kicker, the main argument that he makes, that only with government on the local level, where people can understand the issues and where they understand their representation and representatives know their people, can you have genuine participation. And you'll see this is the common value between Sentinel and Jefferson and even Schomburg when we come back to this issue later. Only on the local level can people have the opportunity to participate on the issues that affect them. And as you're going to see, both Sentinel and Jefferson argue that participation in government is actually the true basis of free government. That you can't have a system like the People's Republic, which all national control. Now, not only because the People's Republic of China is a totalitarian system and supervises its citizens through technology and everything, just like Big Brother in 1984, but literally, China is a top-down country. And the individual doesn't participate much, nor would they want to, because it might get them into trouble. But for Sentinel, participation in your own governance is the critical thing that generates a sense of freedom and communal belonging. So we find the same themes echoed in Jefferson, which is the Nichols selection number 14 on pages 61 through 63. Now, Jefferson was not an anti-Federalist, if only because he wasn't in the country during the drafting and the writing of the Constitution. Jefferson was our ambassador to France and came back to this country when after the Constitution was ratified, and George Washington appointed him as first Secretary of State. And then Jefferson and Madison came to real blows with Hamilton, and President Jefferson for that matter, over how to interpret the powers of the national government, with Hamilton and the Federalists, the Federalist Party, and Jefferson. We'll talk more about the forming of the two-party system later on in the course. Arguing for expanding the national government's powers, and Jefferson and Madison and the Republicans, as the opposition party came to be called in the 1790s, limiting the national government, strengthening the states and the local governments. Now, in these selections, Jefferson is actually making a new kind of proposal. He wants to create a new kind of political subdivision called wards. Tiny units of self-government that would cover education, public safety, welfare, and programs for the poor, etc. And how large would these wards be? He says 6 miles by 6 miles, which would be about from Converse University to the north side of town, and probably on the south side of town. 6 miles to the south would be like where South Park is, or Westgate. So South Park is in Charlotte, Westgate is in Spartanburg. So what's the idea here? And his argument is this: that if you give people real control over the issues that actually affect their lives, not only will they be able to publicly really control the government over them. And by the way, Jefferson wasn't arguing for dismantling the national government. He thought you needed a national government for defense and for foreign affairs and something like commercial regulation. But he thought the bulk of government should remain on the local level and especially be consigned to these new units called wards. And again, his main sense is people aren't really attached. And you have to say that both the founders, the Federalist, Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson, all of them thought the great advantage of a popular or Republican system of government was that the government operated through the consent of the people, that it didn't have to impose itself on the people like through tyrannical means, like the fascists or the communists of our century, or the last century, or of this century in the People's Republic, etc., like North Korea. So the great idea was government by consent, where you don't have to terrorize people into obedience. You may have to use force, like to arrest speeders on the interstate, but the great idea is that if people participate in their own system of government, their own governance, they'll be attached to it, and therefore their obedience of the government, which is partially through their own participation, will be through voluntary attachment. So those are the values you see in both of these authors. The argument is that only through strong local government do you get government that actually meets the needs of localities, that it represents the diversity of interests and values that in a giant nation such as ours, and that actually where people can have some knowledge of their representatives, and where their representatives know their constituents, and where the issues that dominate are primarily local issues that people understand, can have control over, and participate in. In other words, small local government is necessary to the preservation not only personal liberty that Americans cherish and want, but that kind of liberty that comes from being a member in your own community and actually sharing some part of the rule over your own lives. It's kind of like a public freedom or a communal freedom. So let's turn now to the the opposite side of the argument. The argument that that government and all power should concentrate on a strong national center. Now, Hamilton, as I mentioned before, in Federalist 11 makes that argument. And so what are the goods that come from having a strong national government? And he says, well, first of all, the commerce of the nation would expand through a single unit of regulation that would look to the goods of the whole nation rather than the goods of the competing states. And this was true, by the way. I mean, one of the reasons the commerce and the economic prosperity of the country began to decline after the Revolutionary War wasn't just because of the dislocations of the war and the depression that followed the war, when, after all, our primary trading partner was Great Britain before the war, and we were primarily an agricultural nation, and they were on the rise of becoming a manufacturing nation. And so there was a certain amount of depression or recession, even if you want to call it that, after the war. But the argument was that, and this is one of the things that led to the Constitutional Convention, if you remember the Annapolis Convention and then the Constitutional Convention, was that only if the national government regulated commerce on the national level could you step outside the petty squabbles of the states who tried to regulate commerce for their own good. Now, you could say this is probably objectively true. And that if you looked at the rise of the European Union in the last 50 years since the end of World War I, first it started as a common market, and then ultimately the European Union was founded primarily as a way of expanding the commerce of the entire European continent by taking the regulation of commerce out of each of the small member nations and creating a kind of a continental-wide commerce. And by the way, that has worked. The largest economies in the world are, one, the United States. We're still the largest economy. China is second and rapidly approaching us and may overtake us in the next 10 years in terms of just the scope and amount of activity in our national economies. Japan actually comes third, and behind that is the unified European common market, the European Union. So the idea that a strong national government encourages commercial prosperity has some historical and empirical verification. The second thing he argues is that will increase national revenue. And now, of course, it's true under the Articles of Confederation. The national government had no power to raise revenue. But literally, if you have more commercial and economic activity and one great national system of regulation and taxation, you can increase the revenue of the national government, which, by the way, was a real necessity at that time. Now, in our day, the main source of income of the national government is the income tax, and we may discuss more about that later. But at least he was right that without a sufficient revenue base, you can't have things like an army or a navy. More about that in a minute. Or even just the administration of good government on a continental scale. You need money for that. So increased commerce, increased revenue, and increased military and naval strength. That without a strong national navy and army, we can't enforce or protect our interests in the world. And remember, prior to between the Revolutionary War, where our enemy was Great Britain, and the War of 1812, where our enemy was Great Britain, one of our major enemies during the founding time was the Barbary pirates, because they would capture American ships and there was nothing we could do about it except protest. So a strong national government, continental strength government, would lead to commercial prosperity, increased revenue, the ability to project American military and naval strength. And last, he has a kind of an interesting idea here. That ultimately our greatness as a nation depends upon us having a strong national government. And in the last paragraph of the essay, this is rather interesting. He divides the world into four parts: Europe, America, Asia, and Africa. And he says, for too long the Europeans have dominated the rest of the world, subjugating the rest of the world to European interests. And he says, let us disdain to be the instruments of European greatness. Let our own national greatness defend us not only as a nation against European greatness, but to sort of resurrect the honor of the rest of the world. So American national union will lead to a kind of a great nation in world history, in which we can kind of redeem the honor of the human race against the overweening Europeans. Now, you have to say that all of those arguments, those goods, commercial prosperity, national revenue, military and naval strength, and national greatness, are probably impossible without a strong national government. After all, we remember the Roman Empire, or the empires of China or of Japan, or the Aztec or Mayan empires. All of those countries were great historical forces because they were great empires. And to some degree, the response to this it wasn't as if people like Sentinel or Jefferson didn't know that a strong national government might lead to national greatness. After all, by the way, that is the argument that the leadership of the People's Republic makes, that only by having a strong unified China, including Taiwan, will China be able to astride the world as a colossus. Well, the response to this is okay, those might be genuine national goods, but if having a strong national government meant giving up our personal liberties and our control over our own lives through elected government, would you want to do it? And to some degree, you could ask contemporary Americans, would you want these things if it meant living like a citizen in the People's Republic of China or in North Korea, where as long as you attend to your own private business and make your own little money, but never criticize the government or have an opinion about politics or attempt to affect the world around you, you can live in peace. So if having a strong national government meant giving up personal liberty and even participation in our own governance, I think most Americans might have reservations about this bargain. So as you're going to see, I'm going to end the lecture just so it's in manageable parts. So this will be Wednesday, March 9th, Part A. And this is where it stands. We've seen the argument for strong local government, and we've seen the argument for strong national government. And as I've already mentioned, the Constitution clearly tries to compromise between those two things and create a political system where you get both goods. Now, how it does that, and we've seen in the Constitution, by the way, it does that through a couple of ways. Remember the great compromise in the Constitutional Convention, where in the House of Representatives, the American people as a whole are representative, and of course in the executive branch, the nation as a whole. But in the Senate, and to some degree in the Electoral College, and in the amendment system, the states are represented as semi-sovereign states. So the Constitution tries to split. Now, especially in Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution tries to find the right balance between national power and state power by dividing the powers of government between the national government and the state powers. And in some ways, the way the constitutional system works is all of the national government's powers are listed in Article 1, Section 8. If you remember when we talked about the Constitution and the vesting clauses, Article 1, Section 1 says all legislative powers herein granted. That means all legislative powers of the national government are later on in this section, in Section 8, listed. And there are 17 specific powers like commerce, trade, taxation, war, forming an army, a navy, and coining money, etc. And then plus the 18th clause of what's called the necessary and proper clause. We're going to investigate that in the next lecture, or the next segment of this lecture, in McCulloch v. Maryland. But you could have to say that that the Article 1, the enumeration of powers, is an attempt to, and the 10th Amendment, as we'll see, the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States and Congress are reserved to the states or the people, that it's a system in which the great national powers of national life are part of the national government and everything else is left to the states. Now, finding that dividing line is what gets touchy, as you see, especially when we talk about several contemporary issues. So I'll end this lecture right now, and we'll begin with Part B for Wednesday, March 9th, talking about where the balance between the national government and the states is, especially when the interest of the whole country or the national government should predominate over the interest and power of the states.